In this video, I'll be comparing two different color film stocks, Kodak Portra 400 and Kodak Ektar 100, and I'll show you some sample images that I've shot using each film. Hey everybody, welcome to Dan Bullman Photography. If this is your first time watching, please be sure to hit that subscribe button down below to stay up to date on all the latest content I'm putting out. Now let's get to it. Now, when I was first getting into film photography and I wanted to start shooting color film, I didn't really know which film that I should use for which situation. The first films that I was looking at were Kodak Portra 400 and Kodak Ektar 100, which are both highly regarded and highly recommended films. So when should you use Kodak Portra 400 and when should you use Ektar 100? Well, let's talk about that. Kodak Portra 400 is a 400 ISO color negative film that is intended for professional use. Portra 400 is well known for having very true to life color tones, and it's very good for things like portraits, hence the name Portra. So I tend to use Kodak Portra 400 when I'm shooting portraits. It's a very good film stock for doing that, but it's also very versatile for other things like landscapes, cityscapes, street photography. Portra 400 is a film that you really can't go wrong with. So where does Kodak Ektar fit into the scheme of the genres of film that it's good for? Well, Ektar 100 is a very saturated film, and it's a very fine-grained film as well. So I think it's a very good use for things like cityscapes or landscapes in particular, macro photography. Ektar 100 really shines with that. A lot of landscape photographers who like to shoot slide film like Velvia 50 will use Ektar 100 sometimes as an alternative to Velvia because it has a slightly larger dynamic range. Now again, with the 100 ISO, it's really good for outdoor use, but if you're shooting indoors or with not a lot of light, you might want to use flash or some other source of light to really be able to get a proper exposure with Ektar 100. It's also a very fine-grained film, so it's a little less grainy than Kodak Portra 400, but I found when shooting Ektar 100 for portraits, the skin tones are a little bit reddish and it doesn't always look very pleasing. So without further ado, I'm just going to show you some different shots that I've taken with Portra 400 and Ektar 100 and give you a sense of what these films can do. Okay, so I'm going to start off by showing a comparison of what Ektar and Portra look like in similar lighting situations. So this is a photo of Kodak Portra 400. It was shot near Fenway Park, and you get a little bit of reflectiongram down there, hashtag reflectiongram. So if you look at the image, you notice that a lot of the colors are kind of muted. It's kind of true to life. And so this was sort of a rainy, overcast day. But the next image I'm going to show you, also taken on an overcast day in Brookline Village. And if you look at this scene, a lot of the colors are a lot more saturated, a lot richer. Especially if you look at the red tones in this woman's jacket and in the car, you'll really notice that Ektar has saturated the scene a lot more. Again, here is a photo of a train. This is taken in Brookline Village again. Similar lighting situation, overcast day. And again, very neutral, very kind of muted, true to life colors. Now I took a photo of another train, similar lighting situation. And again, if you look at the yellow on the tracks and red on the train, you'll notice that it is a bit more saturated. But Ektar doesn't oversaturate all colors equally. It does seem to saturate red colors a lot more, and green tones don't get quite as saturated. So if you look at the two train photos again, you'll notice that it isn't a huge difference in saturation of the green tones when compared to, say, how the reds get saturated. So I just want to show a couple of more photos of Ektar here to show how it saturates red colors as opposed to green colors. And as you'll see in these two images of the car and the do not enter sign, that it really, really gives you a deep red tone, very saturated look. Whereas if you look at the sign here in Brookline Village, the greens are closer to true to life than I would say the red tones are in the Ektar photos. So Ektar really saturates red tones very heavily, and then with like green tones, it doesn't saturate those quite as intensely. It looks a lot closer to Portra. So you can use Ektar for street photography and landscape situations, and it looks really good in my opinion. But Portra also shines when you're shooting landscapes as well and street photography scenes. So I want to show you some photos from fall here in New England. These are some photos I took back in 2015, I believe. Again, it captures the colors very nicely. So these were taken on the campus of Tufts University, and the colors look really, really good in my opinion. So Portra is also a good opportunity to shoot for landscapes, but you're gonna get a little bit of a different look. Again, where Portra really shines is portrait photography. So I'm going to show you a couple of portraits that I've taken with Portra 400. These images are really just stellar in my opinion. The way that Portra handles skin tones and other tones in a scene just gives you the opportunity to create really pleasing images. And honestly, like, you could probably fool people into thinking that these are digital. I mean, for better or worse, I think Portra does a really good job for portraits. And so, you know, I shoot portraits primarily, and when I'm shooting portraits on film, I usually like to grab something like Portra 400 as opposed to Ektar. And I'm going to show you why here in a minute. Now, Ektar, it struggles a bit as a portrait film. You can use it for portraits, but the way it saturates red tones often gives people a sort of sunburnt look or a very saturated look in their faces, and that can be not that pleasing. So I'm going to show you a couple of photos that I took with Ektar 100 of friends and then compare them to what their skin tone looks like on digital photos, just to give you a sense of like how different Ektar really looks when you're shooting portraits. So these are a couple of portraits I took of my friend Kristen a few years back. So if you were just to look at these photos, you wouldn't necessarily think that, oh wow, her skin tones are really saturated or really overdone, but they kind of are. It's subtle, but if you look at these photos compared to this one, where her skin tones are a lot paler, they're a lot more neutral than the Ektar photos. So Ektar really oversaturates the skin, and for that reason I really don't think it's that pleasing for portraits. I'm going to show one more example here. This is a photo of my friend Rose that I took on Ektar 100. Again, if you look at her face and you look at the tones there, they're very saturated. And you compare that to this image that I took with a digital camera, this is very true to life. This is what her skin tones look like in real life. So when you compare that with the Ektar image, it's very night and day to me. And for that reason, I really don't like to use Ektar 100 for portraits. Now, I have seen examples of people using Ektar 100 for portrait photography very successfully. These were shot on 35mm. I have seen results of people shooting it in 120 who have gotten better looks with Ektar 100, but in my opinion, I kind of shy away from it as a portrait film. So if you do like shooting portraits, I would recommend Portra 400 over Ektar 100. But if you're shooting something like street photography or landscapes, I think you can go with either film, depending on which kind of look you prefer. So which film do you prefer? Leave a comment down below and let me know which one you would rather shoot with, Ektar or Portra 400. My personal preference is to shoot Portra 400. Like I said, I like to shoot portraits mainly, so Portra is a really good film for that. But I also like to shoot a lot of other color film stocks as opposed to Portra, because I sometimes feel like Portra can come off as a little bit more boring because of the neutral color tones. So that's it for today, folks. We'll see you soon. This has been another episode of Dan Bullman Photography. Peace.